Okay, I have the full Spanish script. I will now translate it into American English and adapt all cultural details as requested. This will be a continuous narrative in the first person, as per your instructions. Mum, starting with your next paycheck, we're going to transfer all your money to my account. Those were the words my son, Lawrence, said to me that Thursday afternoon while he was drinking coffee in my kitchen, as if he was proposing something completely normal, as if he was doing me a favor, as if I were incapable of managing my own money at 62 years old. I stared at him. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. I just looked into his eyes, searching for something that would explain why my own son, the boy I raised alone, who I fed with the sweat of my brow, was asking for total access to my bank account. But I didn't find anything. I just saw that calm smile, that confidence of someone who knows they're in control. So I took a deep breath and told him yes, that it seemed fine to me, that I trusted him. Lawrence's smile widened. He stood up, gave me a quick, mechanical kiss on the forehead, one of those kisses that don't mean anything, and told me it was for the best. He said I wouldn't have to worry about a thing, that he would take care of everything, that it was for my own good. For my own good. Those words hung in the air after he left my house. That same night, like every Friday, Lawrence came back. But he didn't come alone. He arrived with his wife, as he always did. He came expecting me to have dinner ready, expecting the table to be set, expecting there to be hot, free food, as there had been every Friday for the past 3 years. I heard them arrive. I heard their footsteps at the front door. I heard the key I had given him turning in the lock. I heard the door open. And then I heard the scream. It was a high-pitched, desperate scream. The scream of someone who has just seen something they didn't expect to see. The scream of someone who just realized that things weren't going to be the way they thought. I stayed seated in my chair, in the empty kitchen, in the empty house, listening to that scream echo against the walls. I didn't move. I didn't go to see what was happening. I already knew what was happening. Lawrence came running into the kitchen. His face was pale, his eyes wide. His wife came in behind him, with the same expression of shock and disbelief. "Mom!" Lawrence yelled. "Mom, what did you do? Where is everything? Where's the furniture? Where's the TV? Where is everything that was here?" I looked at him calmly, with a calmness I didn't even know I had, and I told him, in the softest voice I could find, that I had sold some things, that I needed the money, that after all, if he was going to be managing my finances, I needed to make sure I had some cash first. His face changed from pale to red, from shock to fury. He took a step toward me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my son for what he really was. Not as the boy I had raised, not as the young man I had helped build his life, but as a stranger, as someone who was looking at me with contempt, with rage, with something that looked dangerously like hatred. "You're crazy," he said. "You're completely crazy. How could you sell everything without asking me? Now what are we going to do when we come over? How are we going to be comfortable here?" That was the sentence that changed everything. How are we going to be comfortable here? Not how are you going to be comfortable, Mum. He wasn't worried about how this affected me, but how it was going to affect them. As if my house were their extension, as if my things existed for their convenience. His wife came closer then. She looked at me with those eyes that had always seemed cold and calculating, and she said something I'll never forget. She said I was being selfish, that I was only thinking about myself, that they came every week to keep me company, to make sure I was okay, and that this was how I repaid them. Selfish. Me. The woman who had worked double shifts for years so that Lawrence could go to college. The woman who had given up on starting a new life after his father left us, because I didn't want my son to grow up with a stepfather. The woman who had lived in small apartments, who had worn old clothes, who had eaten the bare minimum so he could have everything he needed. Selfish. Lawrence just stood there, looking at me as if I were a problem he needed to solve. And then he said something that broke me in two. He said maybe it had been a mistake to suggest the bank account to me, that maybe I wasn't in a condition to make good decisions, that maybe I needed more help than he thought. More help. As if I were a burden, as if I were an incapable old woman who needed to be controlled. I got up from my chair then. I looked at them both, and I told them, in a voice that came out stronger than I expected, that dinner wasn't ready, that there was no dinner, that if they were hungry, they could go eat somewhere else. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Lawrence looked at me as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. His wife let out a dry, bitter laugh and muttered something about respect and gratitude. And then Lawrence said the sentence I still hear in my head when I close my eyes at night. He said, with a coldness I'd never heard from him before, that I should be careful, that a woman my age, alone, without family who truly cared about her, could end up in a very bad place, that he was the only thing I had, that I should remember that before I did something stupid. They left then. They stormed out of my house, slamming doors, leaving a trail of rage and veiled threats. I heard them get into their car. I heard the engine start. I heard them drive away. And I stood there, in my empty kitchen, in my empty house, feeling something inside me break for good. But what I felt wasn't sadness. It wasn't despair. It was something different. It was clarity. It was the absolute certainty that my son didn't love me, that maybe he had never loved me, that I was just a resource to him, a source of money, food, and comfort. I sat back down in my chair. I looked at the bare walls of my living room. I looked at the empty spaces where there had once been furniture that I had bought with my labor, with my effort. And for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. Because Lawrence didn't know something. He didn't know that I hadn't sold the furniture for money. I had sold it to send a message, to see how he would react, to confirm what I already suspected deep down in my heart, and he had reacted exactly as I expected. With rage, with indignation, with the attitude of someone who feels they have a right to another person's things. That night, as I sat in the darkness of my empty house, I made a decision. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to do something much more powerful. I was going to observe. I was going to wait. I was going to let Lawrence believe he had won. And then, when he least expected it, when he was most confident, most sure of his control over me, I was going to show him who Patricia Mendez really was. Not the submissive mother he thought he knew, but the woman who had survived a broken marriage, poverty, and years of hard work. The woman who knew exactly how to protect herself. The woman he should never have underestimated. There was a time when I believed that being a mother was enough, that the love I gave would be returned naturally, as if it were a universal law, that the sacrifices I made every day would build something solid, something unbreakable between my son and me. How wrong I was. Lawrence was born on a stormy night, 34 years ago. His father, the man who had promised me a life together, left when the boy was barely 2 years old. He said he wasn't ready to be a dad, that he needed to find himself, that I would understand someday. I never understood. But I also didn't wait for him to come back. I was left alone with a small child, a 2-bedroom apartment that I could barely afford, and a secretary job that paid $800 a month. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. So I got a second job cleaning offices at night. I would leave Lawrence with my neighbor, an elderly woman who charged me $50 a week to watch him. I worked from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening at the office. I would come home, feed Lawrence, bathe him, and put him to bed. And then I would leave again, at 9 at night, to clean buildings until 2 in the morning. I slept 4 hours, and then I would start all over again. I did that for years. For so many years, I lost count. I remember that Lawrence always wanted the brand name sneakers that the other kids at school wore. They cost $120. I earned $1,200 a month from both jobs. $120 was almost all the money I had for food for 2 weeks. But I bought them for him, because I didn't want my son to feel less than anyone else, because I wanted him to know that his mother would do anything for him. I ate rice and beans for an entire month to be able to pay for those sneakers. When Lawrence turned 18, he wanted to go to college, a private university that cost $15,000 a year. I didn't have that money. I didn't even have a tenth of that money. But I went to the bank and took out a loan. I went into debt for 4 full years of education that I ended up paying off for 10 years after. 10 years of paying a loan so that my son could have a college degree. He graduated. He got a good job. He was making $3,000 a month, double what I was making after 30 years of work. And I was happy. I thought that he could finally build his life, that I had finally done my job as a mother well. But Lawrence didn't leave my house right away. He said he wanted to save money, that he wanted to have a solid foundation before living on his own. I told him, of course, that my house was his house, that he could stay as long as he needed. He stayed 5 more years. 5 years in which I was still working my 2 jobs. 5 years in which I paid the rent, I paid for the food, I paid for the utilities. 5 years in which Lawrence saved every single cent of his salary because he didn't have to pay for anything. When he finally left, it wasn't to rent an apartment, it was to buy a house, a $200,000 house that he was able to pay for in cash because he had saved all his money during those 5 years of living for free at my house. I was proud. I told him I was proud. And I was. I thought I had done the right thing by helping him. I thought that now that he had his own house, maybe he could help me. Maybe I could work less. Maybe I could rest a little. But that never happened. Lawrence got married 2 years after he moved out. His wife was an elegant woman, one of those who always dresses well, who always has perfect nails, who always speaks with that tone of voice that sounds polite but hides disdain. From the beginning, I noticed that she looked at me differently, as if I were something inferior, as if she didn't understand why Lawrence came from where he came from. At the wedding, which cost $30,000, I sat at a table in the back, not at the main table with the family. Lawrence explained that it was because there were a lot of important people, clients from his job, and that they needed those tables for them. I said I understood. I smiled in the pictures. I danced when they asked me to. And I went home alone that night, feeling strangely empty. After the wedding, Lawrence's visits became less frequent. Before, he would come to see me 2 or 3 times a week. After he got married, he came once every 2 weeks, then once a month, always in a hurry, always looking at his phone, always with some excuse to leave early. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the annoying mother, the mother who complains, the mother who doesn't understand that her son has his own life now. But then they started coming on Friday nights, always at dinner time, always without notice, always expecting me to have food ready. At first I was happy. I thought that Lawrence finally wanted to spend time with me, that he finally missed me, so I would cook his favorite dishes. I would set the table nicely. I would buy dessert. But I noticed something. I noticed that Lawrence never came alone. He always brought his wife. And I noticed that they never came to talk. They came to eat. They would arrive, sit down, eat, and leave. Sometimes they would stay an hour, sometimes less. I also noticed that they never brought anything. Never a bottle of wine. Never a dessert. Never any money to help with the food. Nothing. One night, after they left, I counted how much I had spent on dinner. $45. $45 that I didn't have to spare. $45 that meant I would have to work extra hours to make up for it. And I realized something. I realized that to Lawrence, I had become a service, a free restaurant, a place where he could come to eat without paying, without even really thanking me. I started to notice other things too. I noticed that when I asked him for help with something, he always had excuses. That when I needed a ride to the doctor because my car was broken, he was always busy. That when I mentioned my refrigerator was making strange noises and that I was afraid it would break down soon, he told me to buy a new one, as if I had $500 saved up for emergencies. I didn't have it. I barely had enough to get to the end of the month. But what hurt the most was my birthday, my 60th birthday. Lawrence arrived 2 hours late, without a gift, without a card, with an excuse about traffic. He stayed for 20 minutes. He ate the cake that I had bought for myself because I didn't want to spend it alone. And he left. I cried that night. I cried like I hadn't cried in years, because I finally understood something that I had been denying for a long time. I understood that to my son, I was no longer important, that I was just a resource, something that was there, available, waiting to be used when he needed it. And the worst part was that I had allowed it. I had established that pattern. I had never asked him for anything. I had never told him that I felt used. I had never told him that I needed more from him than just 20-minute visits and Friday night dinners, because I was afraid. Afraid that if I complained, if I asked, if I demanded, he would disappear completely. And the idea of losing my son, even this son who barely saw me, terrified me more than anything else. So I continued to be the convenient mother, the silent mother, the mother who was always there, who always had the door open, who never caused problems. Until that Thursday afternoon. Until Lawrence told me he wanted to manage my money, and something inside me, something that had been asleep for years, woke up. A small but clear voice that told me this wasn't right, that this was the beginning of something worse. But even then, even with that voice whispering in my head, I told him yes, because I still had hope. I still wanted to believe that my son loved me, that he would protect me, that he would do the right thing. How foolish I was. The following Monday, Lawrence came to my house with papers, lots of papers. He spread them out on the kitchen table with that smile that now seemed different to me, less warm, more calculating. "Mum, this is simple," he told me. "I just need you to sign here, here, and here. They're the documents, so I can have access to your account, so I can transfer your paycheck automatically every month. That way I'll take care of paying your bills, of managing everything. You won't have to worry about a thing." I looked at the papers. They were bank forms, authorization forms. I read the fine print, the stuff people usually ignore, and I saw something that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just access to my account, it was complete power. It was the authority to make transfers, to close accounts, to make financial decisions on my behalf. "Lawrence, this says that you would have total control over my money," I told him. He nodded, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Yes, Mum. This way it's easier. That way I can manage everything without having to ask you for authorizations every time. It's for practicality. Practicality. That word echoed in my head. Practicality for who? I asked myself, but I didn't say it out loud. I took the pen he offered me. I held it in my hand, and for a moment, I was about to sign. I was about to hand over everything, because that's what I had always done. Trust. Hand over. But then I remembered Friday night. I remembered his face full of fury when he saw the empty house. I remembered his words. I remembered how he had threatened me, even though he probably didn't even realize that was a threat. I put the pen down on the table. You know what, Lawrence? Give me a few days to think about it. I want to read everything carefully. I want to be sure. His expression changed, just for a second. Just a flash of irritation that crossed his face before he smiled again. Mum, there's nothing to think about. It's simple. But fine, if you want to take a few days, that's okay. He left then, but he left the papers, as if he assumed I would end up signing them anyway. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed up looking at those papers on the kitchen table, and something inside me told me that this wasn't for my own good, that this was the beginning of something I couldn't undo once it started. The next day I went to the bank. I went early before my job. I asked the teller to check my account, to show me all the transaction from the last 6 months. She printed the papers. They were several pages. I checked them carefully, line by line, and then I saw it. I saw it, and felt the floor move beneath my feet. There was a withdrawal that I hadn't made, a withdrawal of $1,200 from 3 months ago. $1,200 that had left my account and that I didn't remember taking out. I asked the teller if I could see more details. She checked on her computer, and she told me something that took my breath away. She told me that the withdrawal had been made at a branch on the other side of town, with my debit card. But I had never been to that branch, and my card was in my purse. It had always been in my purse, except for one time. I remembered that 3 months ago, Lawrence had come to visit me. I was in the shower when he arrived. I yelled for him to come in, that the door was open. When I came out, he was in the living room, waiting for me. We sat down and talked, and at some point, I went to the kitchen to make coffee. My purse was in my handbag. My handbag was in the living room, with Lawrence. I felt nauseous. I felt like the whole world was tilting in a strange way, because this could only mean one thing. It meant that my son had taken my card. He had memorized or photographed the numbers, and he had taken money from my account without my permission. I asked the bank teller if there was any way to know exactly what had happened with that withdrawal. She told me I needed to file a formal claim, that the bank would investigate, that it could take several weeks. I told her I would think about it, and I left the bank feeling like I no longer knew my own son. But I didn't file the claim, not yet, because I needed to be sure. I needed to know if this had been just one time or if there were more. The next few days I spent checking everything, every paper I had in my house, every document, every old bank statement that I had saved in a box in my closet. And I found more things. I found that 2 years ago, when I was in the hospital for pneumonia, someone had used my health insurance for consultations that I hadn't made. Consultations at clinics I didn't know about. Consultations that had exhausted my annual coverage, which was why I had had to pay out of my own pocket for some medications that year. I also found that there was a credit card in my name that I didn't remember applying for. A card with a balance of $3,000. $3,000 in purchases that I hadn't made, at stores I had never been in. I called the credit card bank. I asked them when the account had been opened. They told me it was 18 months ago. I asked them if they could tell me where the purchases had been made. They gave me a list: hardware stores, electronics stores, home furniture stores. Lawrence had bought a house 2 years ago. Lawrence had renovated that house. And apparently Lawrence had used my credit to do it. I sat on the floor of my bedroom, surrounded by papers, feeling like everything I had believed about my life was falling apart. It wasn't just the money, it was the betrayal. It was knowing that my son had been stealing from me for years, that he had seen me as an unlimited source of resources, that he had never intended to take care of me or protect me. I cried. I cried until I had no more tears. And then I wiped my face, gathered all the papers, and made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him yet. I wasn't going to yell at him or complain, because I knew that if I did, he would deny everything. He would say I was confused. He would say I was senile. He would say anything to make me doubt my own memory, my own sanity. No. I was going to be smarter than that. I was going to collect proof. I was going to document everything. I was going to build a case so solid that he couldn't deny it. And then, only then, would I act. That Friday, Lawrence came back. As always, at dinner time. As always, expecting me to have food ready. But this time I had cooked something different. I had made his favorite dish: chicken with sauce and rice. The same dish I used to make for him when he was a little boy and came home from school feeling sad. The dish that told him how much I loved him without needing words. He sat down at the table with his wife. They ate. They talked about superficial things: work, the weather, the new movie they wanted to see. I watched them. I watched them as if I were seeing them for the first time. And I realized something. I realized that Lawrence ate my food with the same indifference with which he would eat a fast food burger. There was no gratitude in his eyes. There was no love. There was only the mechanical act of eating something for free. When they finished, Lawrence took out the bank papers again. He put them on the table, right next to his empty plate. "Mum, the days you asked for have passed. You've thought about it, right? Sign this, and I'll take care of everything." I looked him straight in the eyes, and I told him, in the calmest voice I could find, that I still wasn't sure, that I needed more time. His wife scoffed. "Patricia, this is ridiculous. Lawrence is just trying to help you. I don't understand why you're being so distrustful." Distrustful. She called me distrustful, and the saddest thing was that she was right, but not in the way she thought. Lawrence stood up. His expression was hard now, without the mask of a smile. "Mum, this is for your own good. You can't keep managing your finances alone. It's obvious. Look at how you sold the furniture without thinking. Look at the irrational decisions you're making." Irrational. Selling my own furniture in my own house was irrational, but stealing from me for years wasn't. I didn't say anything. I just held his gaze until he looked away. They left that night without saying goodbye, and I stayed seated in my kitchen, looking at those unsigned papers, knowing that the war had just begun. A silent war. A war that I had to win. Because if I lost, I wouldn't just lose my money. I would lose my dignity, my autonomy, my life. The days after that dinner became strange. Lawrence didn't call me again. He didn't visit me again. It was as if he had decided to punish me with his absence, as if he believed I would fall apart without him, that I would beg him to come back, that I would finally sign those papers just to get his attention. But I didn't fall apart. For the first time in years, the silence of my house didn't feel empty. It felt full of something different. It felt full of clarity. I spent those days going through every detail of my financial life. Every receipt I had saved, every bank statement, every paper that had any connection to money. And the more I looked, the more I found. I discovered that 3 years ago, when Lawrence asked me to lend him my ID because he had lost his and needed to pick up an urgent package, he had done something else with it. He had opened an electricity service account in my name, at an address that wasn't mine, at his house. For 3 years, the electricity account for Lawrence's house had been in my name, and when he didn't pay on time, the penalties were accumulating on my credit history. That's why I had been denied a small loan last year when my car needed urgent repairs. That's why my credit score had mysteriously gone down. I called the electricity company. I explained that the account wasn't mine, that I had never lived at that address. The woman on the phone told me I needed to file a sworn statement, that I had to report this as identity fraud. Identity fraud, committed by my own son. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall for, I don't know how long, trying to process how I had gotten to this point, trying to understand at what moment my son had become this. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside. And I thought about all the times I had justified his behavior. All the times I had told myself that he was busy, that he had his own life, that I was being demanding by expecting more from him. But this wasn't about expectations. This was about theft, about deception, about a son who saw his mother as a source of resources that he could exploit without consequences. The next morning I did something I had never done. I went to see a lawyer. It was a small office in the city centre. The sign said, William Sanchez, attorney at law. I had seen an ad in the newspaper that offered free consultations. I went in feeling small, feeling ridiculous, a 62-year-old woman coming to complain about her own son. But the receptionist smiled kindly and showed me in. Attorney Sanchez was a man in his 50s, with greying hair at his temples and kind eyes. He asked me to tell him everything, and I did. I told him about the money that had disappeared, about the credit card I hadn't applied for, about the electricity account, about the papers that Lawrence wanted me to sign. He listened without interrupting. He took notes in a notebook, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. Mrs. Mendez, he said, what you're describing to me is financial fraud and a breach of trust. If you sign those papers your son is asking you to, you're giving him total legal access to your money. He could empty it all out, and you would have no legal recourse because you yourself gave him permission. The words fell on me like stones. I knew it. Deep down, I knew it. But hearing it said out loud by a professional made it real in a different way. What can I do? I asked. He leaned forward. First, don't sign anything. Second, you need to report the credit card fraud and the theft from your bank account. Third, you need to change all your passwords, your personal identification numbers, everything. Fourth, consider getting a restraining order if you feel you're in danger. A restraining order against my own son. The idea seemed absurd and devastating at the same time. I don't want to get him in legal trouble, I told him. He's my son. The lawyer looked at me with something that seemed like compassion and sadness. Mrs. Mendez, your son is already in legal trouble. He's committed several felonies. The question isn't whether you want to get him in trouble. The question is whether you want to protect yourself. I left that office with a folder full of forms and a list of things I needed to do. I felt overwhelmed, but I also felt something else. I felt determined. I went straight to the bank. I changed all my passwords. I requested a new debit card. I closed the fraudulent credit card and filed a formal dispute. The teller at the bank helped me with everything. She treated me with patience, without making me feel stupid or weak. When I got home that afternoon, I felt exhausted but also strangely light. as if I had shed an invisible weight I had been carrying for years. That night, Lawrence finally called. His voice sounded tense on the phone. "Mum, we need to talk. Come over for dinner at my place tomorrow. We have to sort this out." It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. And before, I would have obeyed without question. But now, after everything I had discovered, I only felt a cold calm. "I can't tomorrow," I told him. "I'm busy." "Busy? Mum, what can you be busy with?" "This is important. For you, maybe," I said. "For me, there are other more important things now." There was a silence on the other end of the line, a silence heavy with surprise and irritation. "You're acting very weird, Mum. I don't know what's wrong with you, but you need to stop being so stubborn and sign those papers. This is for your own good." For my own good. Those words again. As if stealing from me were an act of love. "Lawrence," I said, with a voice that came out firmer than I expected. "I'm not going to sign anything, and I think we need to have a very serious conversation about several things." "About what things?" he asked. His voice sounded different now, more alert, more cautious. "About money that has left my account without my permission. About credit cards that I didn't apply for. About utility accounts in my name at addresses where I don't live." The silence that followed was absolute, so thick I could almost feel it through the phone. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally said. His voice sounded controlled, but I could detect the panic underneath. "I think you do," I told him. "And I think you need to think very carefully about what you're going to say next. Mum, you're delusional. You're confused. Maybe you need to see a doctor." There it was. The card I knew he would play. The card to make me seem senile, confused, incapable. "I'm not confused, Lawrence. I have all the papers. I have all the proof. And I've already spoken with a lawyer." Another silence. This one longer, heavier. "You spoke with a lawyer." His voice was almost a whisper now, almost a threat. "Yes. And he explained exactly what you've been doing. He explained what fraud is, what's illegal." "Mum, you can't be serious. I'm your son. Everything I've done has been to help you." "Help me? Lawrence, you stole from me. For years. You used me. You lied to me." "I would never," he began to say, but I interrupted him. "Yes, you did. And you know it. The question now is, what are we going to do about it?" I heard his breathing on the other end of the line, heavy, agitated. "I'm coming over," he said. "We need to talk in person." "No," I told him. "You are not coming over. If you want to talk, we can do it on the phone, or we can do it with lawyers present." "You're crazy," he yelled then. "Completely crazy. After everything I've done for you. After all the times I've come to see you that I've worried about you." "All the times you came to eat for free, you mean? All the times you needed something from me. But the times I needed you, where were you?" I hung up then, before he could respond, before he could manipulate me with words again. And I stayed there, sitting in my kitchen, with the phone in my hand, trembling. But not with fear, with rage, with years and years of suppressed rage that was finally finding its voice. That night I slept better than I had in months, because I had finally told the truth. I had finally stood my ground, and although I didn't know what would come next, I knew that I was no longer going to be the silent mother who allowed herself to be trampled on. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. It was as if a thick fog had lifted from my mind, and now I could see everything with an almost painful sharpness. I knew what I had to do. I knew I couldn't stop now. After breakfast, I grabbed my purse and left the house. I had a mental list of all the places I needed to visit, all the loose ends, chidisi, I needed to tie up. If Lawrence thought I was a confused and helpless old woman, he was about to discover how wrong he was. My first stop was the main bank where I had my savings account, not the checking account where I received my paycheck, but the other one, the one I had opened 30 years ago, when I still had dreams of buying my own house someday. I had $7,200 saved. It wasn't a lot after a lifetime of work, but it was mine. I asked the manager to close that account. She asked me if I was sure, if there was a problem. I told her that I just wanted to make some changes. She gave me the money in a cashier's check and recommended that I open an account at another bank for greater security. I followed her advice. I went to a different bank, one on the other side of town, one where Lawrence had never gone with me. I opened a new account, an account that only I knew about, an account where he could never find my money. Then I went to the electricity company. I filed all the documents that Attorney Sanchez had helped me prepare: the sworn statement, the copy of my ID, the proof that I had never lived at the address where that account was registered. The woman who helped me reviewed everything and told me they would start an investigation, that the account would be transferred to the correct name, or closed, that I would no longer be responsible. I felt as if an invisible chain had been removed from my shoulders. My next stop was the credit bureau. I requested a full report of my history. I wanted to see everything. I wanted to know if there were more things that Lawrence had done behind my back. The employee gave me a thick document. I sat in the waiting room and read it page by page. There was something else that I didn't know about. A personal loan of $5,000 taken out 2 years ago in my name. A loan that had never been fully paid and was now in collections. $5,000. I felt the rage rise in my throat again like bile. I marked every fraudulent item with a marker. I filled out the dispute forms, one by one, with clear, firm handwriting. When I left that office, it was almost 3 in the afternoon. I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast, but I wasn't hungry. I had something stronger than hunger. I had purpose. I then went to my neighbour's house, Mrs. Alice Morrison. She was 70 years old and had lived in the building since before I did. We had been friends for decades, although in recent years we had drifted apart a bit. I had been so focused on Lawrence, so consumed with trying to maintain that relationship, that I had neglected other connections. I knocked on her door. She opened it with surprise on her face. "Patricia, what a surprise! Come in, come in." We went into her living room. She offered me coffee, and I accepted. We sat down, and she looked at me with those wise eyes that had seen a lot in life. "You look different," she said. "I don't know what it is, but there's something different about you." And then I told her everything. I told her about Lawrence, about the money, about the betrayal, about everything I had discovered. I talked for almost an hour without stopping, and she listened without interrupting, nodding from time to time, with an expression that mixed sadness and something that looked like recognition. When I finished, she sighed deeply. "Patricia, I knew something wasn't right. I saw it every Friday when he came over, the way he treated you, like you were a service, but I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place. But I'm glad you're finally seeing the truth." She took my hand then. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. "I need to ask you a favor," I told her. "I need you to be my witness. I need that if Lawrence comes and tries to say that I'm confused, that I'm senile, you can confirm that that's not the case, that I am in full control of my faculties." She nodded without hesitation. "Of course. And more than that, if you need a place to stay, if at any time you don't feel safe in your house, my door is open." Those words filled me with a gratitude so deep that it almost made me cry. But I didn't cry. I had cried enough. Now it was time to act. That night, back in my house, I organized all the documents I had collected. I put them in a large folder. I made copies of everything. I put the originals in a safe place and left the copies in the folder. If anything happened to me, if Lawrence tried to do something, there would be evidence. There would be proof. I also wrote a letter detailing everything I had discovered, everything that Lawrence had done. I put it in a sealed envelope with instructions that it was to be opened only in case of an emergency. I gave it to Mrs. Alice to keep. I was preparing myself, like a general preparing for battle, because I knew that Lawrence wasn't going to let this go. I knew he would come, that he would try to manipulate me, to convince me, to make me doubt myself. But I was no longer the same woman I had been 2 weeks ago. That woman had died the night Lawrence threatened me in my own kitchen. The woman I was now was different. She was stronger, more clear, more determined. On Wednesday afternoon, as I was making tea, I heard a car stop in front of my building. I looked out the window and saw Lawrence's car. He got out with his wife. They looked determined. They were coming to confront me. I took a deep breath. I put down my teacup. And I waited. The doorbell rang. Once, twice, 3 times, each time more insistent. I opened the door, but I didn't invite them in. I stayed on the threshold, blocking the entrance. "We need to talk," Lawrence said. His voice was hard, without any pretense of friendliness. "I'm listening," I told him. "Inside, Mom. We're not going to talk in the hallway. We have nothing to talk about inside. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." His wife scoffed. "This is ridiculous, Patricia. Stop acting like we're enemies." "You're not enemies," I told them. "Enemies are honest about their hostility. You are worse. You are thieves who hide behind pretty words." Lawrence took a step toward me. His face was red with fury. "How dare you? After everything I've done for you." "Everything you've done for me?" "Lawrence, I have the records. I have the proof. I know exactly how much money you've stolen from me. I know about the fraudulent credit cards. I know about the electricity account. I know about everything." He froze. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "And now," I continued, with a calmness that surprised me, "you have 2 options. Either you give me back everything you stole from me, every single cent, or I go to the police and file charges for fraud." "You can't do that," his wife said. "He's your son." "That's exactly why it hurts so much," I replied. "Because he's my son. Because I gave him everything, and he repaid me by stealing from me." Lawrence finally found his voice. "You owe me," he yelled. "My whole life I grew up without a father. My whole life I had to see you work and be tired. That was your fault. You chose to have me. You chose to stay alone. I didn't ask to be born." His words landed like blows, but they no longer hurt me like before, because now I could see them for what they were. Justifications, excuses from someone who knew he had done something unforgivable and was trying to shift the blame. "You're right," I told him. "I chose to have you. And it was the best decision of my life until it stopped being. But that doesn't give you the right to steal from me. That doesn't give you the right to exploit me. I didn't steal anything from you. I just took what was owed to me." "Nothing was owed to you. Lawrence, I gave you everything you needed when you were a child. When you were an adult, it was no longer my obligation. And it definitely wasn't my obligation to give you access to my money without my knowledge." His wife grabbed his arm. "Let's go. It's not worth it. She's already lost." Lost. What an interesting choice of words. as if I were the one who was wrong, as if defending my own money and my dignity were crazy. They left then. They went down the stairs without looking back, and I closed the door feeling strangely calm. That night, Attorney Sanchez called me. He told me that the banks had confirmed the fraud, that the credit card money would be cancelled, that they were investigating the unauthorized withdrawals, that I had a solid case if I decided to file criminal charges. I thanked him and hung up. I sat in my empty living room, in my house that no longer had a TV or elegant furniture, and for the first time in a long time, I felt rich. Rich in something that money couldn't buy. Rich in dignity, in strength, in the certainty that I was doing the right thing. The days that followed that confrontation at my door were strangely silent, as if the whole world were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And I found myself trapped in a kind of emotional limbo, where rage and pain mixed with a growing sense of liberation that I didn't know how to process completely. Lawrence didn't call again. He didn't show up at my door again. And for the first time in years, I wasn't constantly waiting for his contact. I wasn't checking my phone every hour to see if there was a message from him. I wasn't making up excuses in my mind to justify his absence or his silence. But even though he wasn't physically present in my life during those days, his digital presence was impossible to ignore, because something in me led me to check his social media. Something I didn't normally do, because it had always seemed like an invasion of privacy, even being his mother. But now I felt I had the right to know what he was doing, what he was saying, how he was presenting his life to the world while I was dealing with the consequences of his actions in private. What I found left me breathless with its audacity, with the absolute disconnect between reality and the image he was projecting outward. He had posted a photo the day after our confrontation, a photo of him and his wife in an elegant restaurant, smiling for the camera with wine glasses in their hands. And the caption said something about celebrating the release of toxic energies and surrounding oneself only with people who bring value to life. As if I were the toxicity he needed to free himself from. As if the fact that I had refused to let him steal more was some kind of negativity that he had had the wisdom to remove from his existence. The comments below the photo were all positive, all congratulating him on taking care of his mental peace, on setting healthy boundaries, on prioritizing his emotional well-being. And I was left staring at that screen, feeling a mixture of disbelief and disgust, because all those people who were supporting him had no idea that the man they were celebrating had been stealing from his own mother for years. There were more posts in the following days, each one more elaborate than the last. As if Lawrence were deliberately constructing a public narrative of his life that had absolutely nothing to do with the truth I knew. A photo of him at the gym, with a reflection on self-care and the importance of investing in oneself before being able to help others. Words that sounded profound and meaningful until you remembered that this was the same man who had used money stolen from his mother to buy gym memberships and expensive athletic clothes. Another photo of him working on his computer, with a comment about the sacrifice and hard work it takes to build a successful future, without mentioning that that future had been partially financed with fraudulent credit cards in my name and utility accounts that I was paying for without knowing it. What impacted me the most was a post he made that Friday, exactly the day he would normally have come to my house for dinner. A post where he shared an old photo of when he was a child with me. A photo I didn't even know he had. A photo where I was holding him in my arms when he was maybe 5 years old and we were both smiling. And the text that accompanied the photo was something about how sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who hurt you the most. About how he had learned that love doesn't mean tolerating abusive behavior. About how he had made the difficult decision to distance himself from a toxic family relationship for the sake of his mental health. Reading those words felt like someone had punched me in the stomach, because Lawrence had taken our story, our real relationship, with all its complicated and painful nuances, and had completely inverted it, presenting himself as the victim and me as the abuser. The comments on that post were even more abundant than the previous ones. Dozens of people expressing their support, telling him how brave he was for setting those boundaries, sharing their own stories of difficult family relationships, completely validating his fabricated version of events. There were people I knew in those comments, neighbors who had known her when she lived with me, co-workers who had come to parties at my house years ago, all of them offering him words of encouragement and solidarity, without having the slightest idea that the person he supposedly needed to protect himself from was the same woman who had worked 2 jobs for years to give him the education that he now used to get his high-paying job. For several days, I watched this digital spectacle in silence, without commenting, without reacting publicly in any way, because something in me knew that this was exactly the game Lawrence was playing, and that if I responded emotionally, I would be falling into his trap, giving him more ammunition for his narrative that I was the unstable and problematic mother he needed to distance himself from. But every new post, every new supportive comment he received from people who didn't know the truth was like a small wound opening up somewhere deep inside me. Not because I cared what those people thought of me specifically, but because it hurt me to see how easily people believed a well-told story without questioning if there could be another version of events. The last straw came when Lawrence posted a story on his account where he showed the house he and his wife had bought, showing the renovations they had made, the new furniture they had acquired, the perfectly designed garden, all presented as the fruit of his hard work and his dedication, without a single mention of the fact that a significant part of all that had been paid for with money that wasn't his, with credit that had been obtained fraudulently using my personal information. He showed it all with so much pride, with so much satisfaction, as if he really believed that he had earned it all himself, as if he had completely forgotten, or simply didn't care that every brick of that house was partially built on the sacrifice and theft of his own mother. I watched him live his life in those small digital windows and wondered how it was possible that someone could sleep at night, knowing what they had done, how it was possible to maintain that facade of a successful and ethically correct person while simultaneously having committed fraud and theft against the person who gave them life. I wondered if he ever felt guilt, if ever in the middle of one of those elegant dinners in expensive restaurants, or during one of those workouts at the gym, he would stop for a moment and think about his mother, sitting alone in an empty house after having sold her furniture so she could eat, because her own son had been systematically stealing from her for years. But looking at his posts, seeing the ease with which he built and maintained this perfect public image, I came to understand something fundamental about Lawrence that maybe I had always known on some level, but had never wanted to fully admit to myself. And that was that my son had developed the ability to create parallel realities in his mind, where he could be simultaneously the abandoned son who deserved compensation and the successful man who had built everything himself, where he could justify theft as something that was rightfully his, while presenting himself publicly as a victim of family toxicity. It was a form of cognitive dissonance so deep that it almost seemed as if he really believed his own lies, as if he had built a narrative so elaborate in his head that the line between truth and fiction had been completely blurred. And as I watched all this from the silent distance of my empty house, something inside me hardened even more than it already was, because seeing Lawrence not only steal from me but also steal my story, completely inverting the roles of victim and victimizer in his public presentation of events, made me understand that there was no redemption possible here. There was no conversation I could have with him that would make him see the reality of what he had done. He had chosen his path. He had chosen the lie over the truth. He had chosen image over substance. and I needed to accept that the son I had raised and loved had never really existed in the way I believed, or had been completely replaced by this stranger who could smile for the camera while destroying his mother in private without apparently feeling any genuine remorse. The moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in a way I hadn't planned, but in retrospect, I realized had been inevitable from the beginning, because the truth always finds its way to the light, no matter how many layers of lies are piled on top of it, trying to keep it buried. I was in Attorney Sanchez's office, going over the final documents of the case, when he informed me that the banks had completed their investigations and had confirmed a total of $17,000 in fraudulent transactions over the course of 3 years. An amount that took my breath away, not so much because of the number itself, but because of what it represented in terms of planning and premeditation. Because this had not been a mistake or a moment of weakness, but a systematic and deliberate operation of theft that had required constant effort and dedication on Lawrence's part. The lawyer explained to me that with this evidence, I had more than enough to file criminal charges, but that there was also another option that I might want to consider before making that final decision. And that option was to send a formal demand letter to Lawrence, giving him the opportunity to return the stolen money and compensate for the damages before proceeding with more severe legal action. He told me that this was a courtesy that many victims of family fraud offered because they understood that no matter how serious the crime was, there were still family ties that complicated the situation in ways that didn't apply in cases of fraud committed by strangers. But he also warned me that this courtesy could be seen as weakness on the perpetrator, and that I needed to be prepared for the possibility that Lawrence would respond not with gratitude or remorse, but with more manipulation and denial. I thought about that for several minutes, sitting in the lawyer's office, looking at all the documents scattered on the desk that meticulously detailed every fraudulent transaction, every unauthorized account, every lie that my son had carefully constructed for years. And I realized that a part of me still held a small, irrational hope that if Lawrence was confronted with the irrefutable evidence of what he had done, maybe something in him would awaken. Maybe he would find some vestige of a conscience or remorse, or at least the basic recognition that he had crossed a line that should not have been crossed. That part of me that was still his mother, despite everything, wanted to give him that opportunity to do the right thing, to correct his mistake, to show that somewhere deep inside him there still existed something of the person I had raised with so much love and sacrifice. But there was another part of me, stronger and clearer, that knew exactly what Lawrence would do with that opportunity. And that part knew that he would not take it as an extension of grace, but as a confirmation that I was too weak to really hurt him, that he could continue to manipulate and control me, because at the end of the day I would always give in, because I was his mother, and mothers always forgive, always give another chance, always choose love over justice. That part of me understood that giving him a private warning would only give him time to prepare his defense, to hide more evidence, to build an even more elaborate narrative of victimization that he could use publicly to destroy my credibility before I could act. I told Attorney Sanchez that I didn't want to send a private letter, that I didn't want to give Lawrence the opportunity to respond in private, where he could continue controlling the narrative and manipulating the situation in his favor. And instead, I asked him to prepare the necessary documents to file a formal civil lawsuit that would become a public record, where anyone who wanted to verify the truth could do so instead of simply believing the version of events that Lawrence had been so carefully building on his social media. The lawyer nodded with what seemed to be a mixture of surprise and respect, because he probably didn't expect a woman my age to make such a direct and unambiguous decision, and he told me that he would proceed immediately with the preparation of all the necessary documents, and that Lawrence would be officially notified within the next 72 hours. I left that office feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, and that at first I couldn't identify exactly until I realized that it was power. The power of having made a decision completely by myself, without consulting anyone, without asking for permission, without worrying about how it would make me look to others, or if people would think I was being too harsh with my own son. For the first time in decades, I had chosen to protect myself over protecting the feelings or the reputation of another person, even when that person was a son. And that choice, although painful, filled me with a sense of integrity that I had forgotten it was possible to feel. The notification reached Lawrence on a Thursday morning, as Attorney Sanchez confirmed to me by phone. And although I was not there to see his initial reaction, I could perfectly imagine the moment he opened that official envelope and read the documents that detailed every fraudulent transaction, every unauthorized account, every dollar he had stolen, meticulously documented with dates and bank reference numbers that made any denial impossible. I didn't have to wait long to confirm my imagination, because less than 2 hours after he received the notification, my phone began to ring with an insistence that bordered on desperation. Call after call that I let go to voicemail without answering, because I no longer had anything to say to Lawrence that wasn't contained in those legal documents. I listened to the voicemails later that night, when I finally felt emotionally prepared to do so. And it was fascinating in a disturbing way to hear the progression of his panic through each successive message, because the first one still tried to maintain some composure with that controlled voice he used when he tried to seem reasonable, as he told me that this was a terrible misunderstanding, and that we needed to talk immediately before things got more out of control. The second message already had a different tone, more high-pitched, more urgent, where he was pleading with me to call him, that this was going to ruin his life, that I should please think about what I was doing before destroying my own son, as if I were the one who was destroying something, instead of simply revealing the destruction he himself had caused for years. By the fifth message, Lawrence was no longer trying to sound reasonable or appeal to my maternal compassion, but had completely turned to rage and thinly veiled threats, telling me that I was going to regret this, that he had his own lawyers who were going to prove that I was a senile old woman who didn't know what she was doing, that he was going to fight this with everything he had, and that in the end, I was going to be the villain of this story. I listened to each message until the end, without allowing myself to feel anything other than a kind of clinical curiosity about how a person could so quickly go from pleading to threatening when they realized that their usual manipulation tactics no longer worked. The following days were a whirlwind of legal and emotional activity, because Lawrence didn't stay still, but began his own counter-campaign, starting by publishing a long and elaborate statement on his social media about how he was being the victim of a terrible injustice perpetrated by a mother he supposedly loved, but who was now legally attacking him for reasons he couldn't fully comprehend. His post was carefully drafted to generate maximum sympathy, without mentioning any specific details of the accusations against him, painting himself as the confused and hurt son who was being dragged through a traumatic legal process by a mother who was perhaps experiencing age-related mental health problems. The response to his post was exactly what he expected, with dozens of comments expressing shock and solidarity, telling him to keep his head up, that the truth would eventually prevail, that they were on his side no matter what. And I watched all this from a distance with a mixture of awe and repulsion at his ability to manipulate the narrative, even when faced with documented legal charges. But something had changed in me, because this time, his public theatre didn't affect me in the same way as before. This time, I knew I had something more powerful than his carefully constructed words, and that something was irrefutable legal documents that could not be manipulated with emotional rhetoric or appeals to sympathy. Lawrence's real collapse began when his own lawyers reviewed the evidence against him and apparently told him something he didn't want to hear, because suddenly his social media posts stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening in its eloquence. Attorney Sanchez informed me that Lawrence's legal representatives had contacted him asking about the possibility of reaching an out-of-court settlement, which basically confirmed that they knew he had no real defense against the evidence I had presented, and that his best option was to try to minimize the damage before this proceeded to a public trial, where all the dirty details would be revealed in public access documents. It was then that the cracks began to appear in Lawrence's carefully constructed life, because apparently some of his closest friends had started asking uncomfortable questions after his wife casually mentioned at a social gathering that they were dealing with a complicated family legal problem. And once people began to investigate a little deeper, they discovered the public documents of the lawsuit that detailed the specific accusations of financial fraud. Mrs. Alice told me that she had heard from other neighbors that Lawrence's name was being mentioned in neighborhood conversations in ways that were definitely not flattering, that people who had once seen him as the successful and educated son now looked at him with suspicion and distrust. His wife was apparently furious, not necessarily about the moral implications of what Lawrence had done, but about the damage to their social reputation, and according to rumors that reached my ears through the neighborhood gossip network, there had been considerable fights in their house about how to handle the situation. Lawrence tried to call me several more times during those weeks, but I maintained my absolute silence because there was nothing he could say to me that would change the documented facts of what he had done. And that silence of mine was apparently more devastating to him than any angry word I could have said, because it meant that I had completely moved from anger to indifference. And that indifference was the final death of any power he ever had over me. The final settlement was reached 3 months after I filed the lawsuit, and the terms were exactly what Attorney Sanchez and I had established as the minimum acceptable, because Lawrence had no choice but to accept when his own lawyers explained to him that going to trial would mean not only the complete public revelation of all the details of his fraud, but also the very real possibility of criminal charges that could result in jail time. He had to return the full $17,000 plus another $5,000 in compensation for damages, in addition to paying for all the credit cleanup fees and my lawyer's fees. And all of this had to be paid within a period of 6 months, with verifiable monthly payments, or the agreement would be automatically invalidated, and the criminal charges would proceed without further warning. But beyond the money, which honestly had never been the main point of all this, the agreement included a clause that I had insisted on adding, and that Attorney Sanchez initially thought was unnecessary, but that for me was absolutely essential. And that clause stated that Lawrence had to issue a public statement acknowledging that he had committed financial fraud against his mother, and that the accusations in my lawsuit were true and well-founded. He fought that clause more than any other part of the agreement because he knew exactly what it would mean for his carefully cultivated image to publicly admit that everything he had been saying about being a victim of a toxic mother was a lie designed to cover up his own crimes. The statement appeared on his social media on a Tuesday afternoon and was brief and clearly drafted by his lawyers to minimize the damage as much as possible within the limits of what the agreement required. But still, the words were there in black text on a white background, admitting that he had accessed bank accounts without authorization, that he had opened credit cards using another person's information, and that he had made serious errors in judgment that he deeply regretted. The comments under that post were wild, with people who had previously supported him unconditionally now expressing shock and disappointment, while others, who had apparently suspected something all along, felt validated in their doubts. And I watched all that digital drama unfold with a sense of closure that had nothing to do with satisfaction or revenge, but simply with the quiet recognition that the truth had finally been told publicly. The first payment arrived in my account on the exact date specified, and each subsequent payment arrived punctually as well, because Lawrence knew that a single missed payment would mean consequences that he definitely could not afford to face. And with that money, I did something that maybe he never expected me to do, because instead of simply putting it back into my savings accounts or using it to replace the furniture I had sold, I bought a plane ticket to a place I had never been before. I had spent 62 years living for other people, first for my son's father, then for my son, and then for the illusion of maintaining a family relationship that only existed in my imagination. And now, for the first time in my adult life, I had the freedom and the resources to live exactly how I wanted, without having to justify my decisions to anyone. I bought a small house in a coastal town, 3 hours from where I had lived my whole life. A house with 2 rooms and a yard, where I could finally plant the flowers I had always wanted, but had never had time to care for when I was working 2 jobs. The house cost $40,000, which I paid for in cash, using a combination of the payments from Lawrence and the savings I had managed to protect in my new bank account. And when I signed the purchase papers, I felt something that I could only describe as a rebirth, because this house was mine in a way that no other place had been mine before. Purchased with money that had been returned through justice, not earned through endless sacrifice. Lawrence tried to contact me one last time after the last payment was made, completely fulfilling the terms of the agreement. And this time I answered the phone, because I knew that there was nothing he could take from me or use against me. His voice sounded different, smaller, more humble, when he asked me if we could ever really talk, if there would ever be a possibility of some kind of reconciliation. And I listened to his question in silence before responding with words that I had been preparing in my mind for months. I told him that the son I raised never really existed or died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone I didn't know and didn't want to know, and that although I wished him peace and growth in his life, that peace and that growth would have to happen away from me, because I had closed that door not out of hatred, but out of self-love. There was a long silence after my words, and then a sound that could have been a sob or just broken breathing before he hung up without saying anything else. And that was the last time I spoke with Lawrence, because some doors, once closed, need to stay closed, not as a punishment, but as a protection. Now I live in my small house by the sea, and I spend my mornings drinking coffee in my garden, watching the flowers that I planted with my own hands grow. And there is a peace in this simple life that I never found in all those years of sacrifice and giving, because I finally understood that true love begins with oneself, and that no relationship is worth maintaining if it requires you to betray your own dignity. Sometimes I see Mrs. Alice, who comes to visit me every few weeks, bringing gossip from the old neighborhood and news of people we used to know. And she tells me that I look different now, lighter, more alive in ways that go beyond the physical. I have a routine now that is completely mine. I wake up when my body wants to wake up, not when an alarm clock forces me to. I cook meals that I like, without thinking about someone else's tastes. I spend my afternoons reading books that I always wanted to read but never had time for. And at night, I sit on my small porch, listening to the distant sound of the waves, and feeling a deep gratitude, not for what I have in material terms, but for what I finally understood about my own worth. This is my victory. Not in the money recovered or in Lawrence's public admission, but in the fact that I recovered myself from decades of conditioning that had taught me that a mother's worth was measured only by how much she could give and how much she could endure. I learned that saying no is an act of self-love, that setting boundaries is not cruelty, but necessity, that protecting your peace is not selfishness, but wisdom. And now I live every day as a testament to those lessons learned too late, but not too late to matter. I closed that door on Lawrence not for revenge, but for dignity, and that distinction that makes all the difference. because it means that I won not by becoming his enemy, but simply by refusing to continue being my own victim.